Today, we have a really special bonus episode lined up for you all. It's a collection of 5 true scary stories about regular folks who encountered genuine, real-life monsters. Now, these 5 stories are fan favorites, and they've all been completely re-edited specifically for today's episode. So, even if you think you've seen or heard some of these before, this updated version should feel like a brand new viewing experience. But before we dive into today's 5 tales, if you're a fan of stories that are strange, dark, and mysterious, then you've definitely come to the right place because that's precisely what we do. We upload new content once a week. So if that sounds interesting to you, please secretly reverse the car blinker wires, so when you signal left, the right one flashes and vice versa. Also, please subscribe to our channel and activate all notifications. That way you won't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get started with today's 5 stories. Music. Back in 1978, 16-year-old Bridget Geiger was waiting outside her home in Ohio for a boy named Jeffrey to arrive and take her to the prom. She wasn't particularly thrilled about going to the prom with Jeffrey. He had a reputation for being incredibly nervous around girls, so she figured the date would be pretty awkward, but no one else had asked her, and she really wanted to experience prom, so she accepted his invitation. When Jeffrey finally showed up, she was immediately disappointed. He was wearing this bizarre outfit consisting of a vest and bow tie, instead of the classic tuxedo she had been expecting. Because of this, they wouldn't match. He was also so nervous that he was visibly shaking and couldn't even manage to pin her corsage to her dress. As a result, Bridget's mom had to come outside and attach the corsage for her. After the corsage was secured, Bridget's mom insisted on taking a couple of very awkward photos of them standing stiffly in front of the house before they ultimately climbed into Jeffrey's car and drove towards the prom. When they arrived at the venue, Bridget was hoping to head straight for the dance floor to meet up with her other friends, hoping it would help lighten the mood because she wasn't having a particularly good time with Jeffrey so far. But she stuck with him for a little while, although it was clear that Jeffrey absolutely hated being at the prom. He couldn't stand being around the large, swarming group of teenagers. Bridget felt a little bad for him and said, "Hey, Jeffrey, how about we go sit down and grab something to eat over at that little food cart they have over there?" Jeffrey was obviously relieved and quickly responded, "Yes, I'd really love to do that." So, the pair left the dance floor and walked over to the little food court area. As they were getting ready to sit down, Jeffrey pulled the chair out for Bridget. She sat down and he sort of pushed her in like a gentleman, but then, instead of sitting down with her, he just walked away without telling her where he was going. Bridget just assumed that he was heading to the bathroom, but after a really long time had passed, and it was obvious that he had not just gone to the bathroom, she got up to go look for him. She went back to the dance floor, but couldn't find him anywhere inside the building. So, she went outside to see if maybe his car was gone. Maybe he had just left. She saw his car was still in the parking lot. When she turned around to go back inside the prom, she spotted Jeffrey sitting on a curb eating McDonald's cheeseburgers. She walked over to him and was like, "What are you doing out here?" So, he explained that he just wanted to step outside and grab a couple cheeseburgers and then come back in and sit with her while she ate. But they wouldn't let him back inside. So, he just went and got more cheeseburgers and decided he would wait there until she came outside. And now that she was outside, she couldn't get back in either. So she just said, "Hey, I think I'd like to just go home." And so Jeffrey was mortified and he told her, "I am so sorry. I really wanted this to be a nice evening for you. I'm sorry it wasn't." He drove her home, said goodbye, and she walked into her house. He drove off, and that was the end of that. Bridget only saw Jeffrey one more time after that night. It was about a week after prom, and Jeffrey actually invited her to come over to his house for what he called a house party. Bridget thought to herself, "There's absolutely no way this kid is throwing a house party. He can barely handle being around just me, let alone a crowd of people." But she was polite and said, "Sure, I'd love to come to your house party." She arrived and there was no food, no music, and only 3 people there. As soon as she walked in, all Jeffrey wanted to do was have a seance and communicate with the devil. She was so immediately creeped out by Jeffrey's behavior that after only a couple of minutes, She turned around and left his house party and did not see him again. Well, until 13 years later, when she would read about him in the newspaper. 13 years later, on July 22, 1991, police in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, spotted a man named Tracy Edwards running down the road in handcuffs. They ran over to him and said, "What's going on?" And he told them that a man was holding him hostage in his apartment and had threatened to kill him. He was able to overpower him and escape. The police went to the apartment where he apparently escaped from, knocked on the door, and a tall man answered, introducing himself as Jeffrey. He told the police that this was all a big misunderstanding and that Tracy Edwards was a friend of his, and he didn't know what was going on with him. The police were actually close to believing him. They would even say that he was really convincing. But as they were talking to him, one of the officers glanced behind Jeffrey into his apartment and saw what were clearly pictures of dismembered body parts on the coffee table. They immediately arrested Jeffrey, and when his apartment was fully searched, a literal house of horrors was revealed. In addition to the gruesome photos, the apartment was filled with human remains. There were several human heads in the freezer and refrigerator. In his bedroom, they discovered a 57-gallon drum containing more dead bodies decomposing in chemicals. There was also evidence suggesting that Jeffrey was eating these people. Now, Jeffrey lived in a crowded apartment complex, and other neighbors had complained about a terrible smell coming from his room, but he had always been able to explain it away, convincing everyone that it was just some bad meat. However, the most horrifying revelation about how Jeffrey was able to conceal these unspeakable crimes he was committing in the middle of a city apartment would come a few days later. Apparently, 2 months before Tracy Edwards had run out of Jeffrey's apartment in handcuffs and flagged down those officers, another boy had left the same apartment in handcuffs and was running down the road when police stopped him. But the boy couldn't really speak. He wasn't able to clearly articulate why he was there or what he was doing. As the police were talking to him, Jeffrey came running up the road, flagged the officers down, and thanked them for finding his boyfriend, claiming that they had gotten into a lover's quarrel and that everything was fine. The police shrugged it off and said, "No problem. We'll even give you a ride back to your apartment." So, they drove the boy and Jeffrey back to Jeffrey's apartment, watched them go inside, and then the police left. But if the police had paid a little bit more attention, they would have noticed a hole drilled in the back of the boy's head by Jeffrey. He had been pouring acid into the kid's head to try to control him. That was why the boy couldn't speak. As soon as the police let them go back into the apartment, Jeffrey killed the boy. Bridget's prom date, Jeffrey, turned out to be none other than the infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 17 people over a 13-year period. Just days after this picture was taken of Jeffrey and Bridget, right before they headed off to prom together, Jeffrey would kill his first victim, starting that horrifying 13-year killing spree. Dahmer was ultimately given a life sentence, but was later killed by another inmate. Music. In 2004, 16-year-old Misty Tasker was a typical American teenager living in Live Oak, Florida, which is a small rural town right in the middle of the state. One Saturday evening in January, she and her mother attended a church service. Afterward, they hopped in her mother's truck and headed onto the country highway, beginning their drive home. Their house was just a short 20-minute drive down this highway. It was a straight shot, but the highway was pretty desolate. There were no streetlights, and the road was actually a dirt road, despite being a highway. Thick forests surrounded both sides of the road for the entire stretch. There were no buildings or houses between the church and their neighborhood. Misty's mother was already a very anxious driver who would keep both hands firmly on the wheel. She would sit up straight, kind of hunching over the wheel, keeping her eyes intently focused on the road. At night, her driving anxiety would skyrocket because she had really bad eyesight. She would go to great lengths to avoid driving at night to prevent experiencing that heightened level of anxiety. However, the church service they had just come from had run a little bit longer than usual. So, Misty's mother was now driving as the sun began to set, trying to get home before it got too dark. They were speeding down this road at about 55 miles per hour, even though it was a 40 miles per hour zone. Misty, who was in the passenger seat, just happened to glance over at her mother for no particular reason. As she was looking at her, She noticed a little girl sitting on the side of the road out of her mother's window. What would a child be doing out there in the middle of nowhere? She said to her mom, "I think I just saw a little girl." Misty's mother, focused on the road, didn't hear Misty the first time. She was just concentrating on driving and trying to get home. Misty said again, "I think I just saw a little girl. We need to go back. I don't know what she's doing, but I feel like we need to go back and make sure she's okay." Misty's mom looked over at her, clearly not thrilled about turning the car around. Turning around meant staying out later and driving in even darker conditions. "Did you really see someone? We have to get home." Misty responded, "Mom, I'm pretty sure I saw a little girl. We have to go back." Finally, Misty's mother, though obviously annoyed, stopped the car. She did a 3-point turn and started driving back up the road toward where Misty thought she had seen the girl. They hadn't gone more than a half-mile from where Misty believed she had seen the girl. They slowed down because Misty said, "I think she's in this area." They both started scanning the right side of the road, as that's where she would be now that they had turned around. It was beginning to get dark outside, but there was still enough light and they had their headlights, so they were confident they would be able to spot this girl. As they slowly rolled down the road, they both saw the girl a little ways up on the right-hand side. Her back was to the road. She had her knees tucked up to her chest, and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother mentioned that it was a little surprising to see a girl out here. There was really nothing around. No houses, no buildings, no trails to walk on in the forest on either side. It was just thick woods. She thought it was strange that a girl would even be out there, especially since there was hardly any traffic on this road. Misty's mother began slowly rolling up to her and told her daughter that instead of just stopping right away, let's just drive past her and get a good look at her, and then we'll turn around and see if she needs any help. As they got right up next to her, they realized she wasn't a little girl at all. She was a young teenager, but definitely not a small child. As they drove past her, they expected her to turn around and acknowledge the car approaching. Considering there was no other traffic in the area, and she was just sitting on the side of the road, you would expect her to turn around and see what was behind her. But the girl didn't acknowledge them at all. She just continued to keep her knees up to her chest and rock back and forth. Misty and her mother were a little freaked out by this, but they drove past her about 50 meters. Misty's mother did a 3-point turn, and as they looked back down the road where the girl should now be on their left-hand side, they were now oriented back toward their house. But she wasn't there anymore. There were no streetlights, and it was almost completely pitch dark outside. All they had were their headlights. Misty told her mom, "Drive up a little ways. Maybe the girl stood up and moved, and we just can't see her because she's not in the headlights." Misty's mom began driving down the road, turning slightly towards the left to shine the light more to that side. But there was no sign of the girl. For good measure, they turned slightly to the right to shine the lights more to the right side of the road, but there was still no sign of her. Misty and her mother just slow-rolled back down the road, keeping their eyes peeled on both sides. After traveling for several minutes, going about 5 to 10 miles an hour and seeing no sign of the girl, they decided that she must have just gone back into the woods, returning to wherever it was she came from. Misty's mom began picking up speed, and before long, they had gone maybe 2 or 3 miles away from where they had seen the girl. They were coming up to a 4-way intersection with stop signs on all corners. As they were getting close, Misty's mother gasped. On the other side of the intersection, on the right-hand side, was the same girl sitting on the side of the road. She had her back to the road, her knees tucked up, and she was rocking back and forth. Misty's mother pulled up to the stop sign and just sat there. Both women were stunned at what they were seeing. They had just seen her 2 or 3 miles back down the road. There was no way she could have gotten all the way up here that quickly. Misty's mother looked at her daughter and asked, "Do you think it's a different girl?" Misty replied, "No, that's the same girl." They sat there for a minute until Misty started to panic. She said to her mom, "Mom, don't stop. I have a bad feeling about this girl. I don't know what's going on, but you can't stop next to this girl." Misty's mom was definitely weirded out by the situation, no doubt. But she didn't feel right about abandoning this girl in the middle of the night on the side of the highway. Even though she felt hesitant herself, she told Misty, "We have to at least drive past her and ask if she's okay. That's the least we can do." Misty wasn't having it. She said, "Mom, do not stop. I have a bad feeling about this. Don't stop near this girl." Misty's mom took her foot off the brake and began slowly rolling past the intersection. At this point, Misty was absolutely terrified. She took her seatbelt off and went down into the footwell right in front of her seat. She closed her eyes, covered her ears, and continued to beg her mother to please just keep going. Don't stop. But her mother just continued on until she stopped right next to the girl, who was still sitting on the side of the road with her back to the road, knees up, rocking back and forth. She wasn't acknowledging Misty or her mother. Misty's mother turned to her daughter and said, "Please roll down your window." Misty refused. She was still down in the footwell, still in the fetal position, crying and begging her mother to please just go home. Misty's mother, frustrated, reached across the passenger seat and grabbed the knob to manually roll down the window. Misty, still down in the footwell, remembered sitting there covering her ears and crying. Then she opened her eyes and looked up towards her mom, who was reaching over the seat. Her mom yelled out to the girl, and Misty remembered looking at her mom, who suddenly recoiled in horror, screamed, and then took off like crazy, flying down the road. Misty jumped out of the footwell and looked at her mom, asking, "What's happening? What just happened? What did you see?" Her mom had her hand over her mouth, speeding down the road, crying and looking at Misty, but she couldn't find the words to describe what she had just seen. Misty kept asking her mom, "What did you see? What happened?" Finally, her mother said, "She didn't have a face. She didn't have a face. It was hollow. There was nothing on her face when she looked at me." Misty screamed, crying along with her mom as they sped home. They arrived home just a couple of minutes later, practically falling over each other to get inside the house. As soon as they got inside, Misty's mom called 911. She didn't even know how to describe what she had just seen. It was too embarrassing to try to describe it as some girl without a face sitting by the highway. She told the police that they had seen a girl they thought needed help. The police went out and searched that entire stretch of highway, looking for any sign of anybody out there, but there wasn't. There was never any trace of that girl. Music. In 2018, a 21-year-old brand new police officer named Derek was dumped by his longtime girlfriend. This breakup was completely unexpected because he had recently moved to Colorado to be closer to her. Naturally, he was devastated. After a few weeks of being depressed, moping around, and just going through the motions, one of his close friends suggested, "Hey man, why don't you make a profile on Tinder, the online dating service, and just put yourself out there again? You have no idea who's out there. Clearly, your ex-girlfriend was not the one." Derek had met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girlfriend he had ever had, he had met in person. Online dating was definitely not something he had considered. But he was so lonely and sad that he figured, "You know what? I got nothing to lose." So, he created a Tinder profile. Derek quickly matched with a woman on Tinder named Leah that he said was way out of his league, but he wasn't complaining. They chatted for a couple of weeks and got along great, so they decided to meet each other in person. Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek's place, making it difficult to find a natural meeting spot. They went back and forth trying to decide where they wanted to go. Finally, Leah suggested, "Hey, why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time, and they have this awesome field that's on a slope. You can lie on it, look up through the trees, and see the stars. It would be cool to go stargazing together on our first date." The date night finally arrived, and Derek was really excited but also nervous because even though they had talked on the phone, this was the first time they were going to see each other face to face. The plan was for him to drive out to her town and pick her up from her work. She worked at a hair salon, and from there, they would head over to the park. Derek pulled up to the hair salon right as Leah was coming outside, all excited and waving to him. She ran over, got in the car, and they hugged and kissed on the cheek. It was like they knew each other, but they didn't really know each other because their entire relationship had been online or via texting or phone calls. It was like they had a history, but they didn't. Either way, Derek was really happy, and it seemed like Leah was too. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to the access road that would take them into the park. When Leah told him to make the turn, it didn't look like a well-marked trail or even a marked park. It looked like some random access road that Derek wouldn't have associated with a big public park. But he didn't know the area, so he made the turn and started heading down the road. The road quickly went from cement to dirt. The whole time he was thinking to himself, did I take a wrong turn? Does she even know where she's going? This doesn't feel like the way you drive into a big park the way she was describing. Finally, they land back on cement, and they're actually on this road that's right up against this huge field. And so, right away, Derek's stress just vanished because now, in his mind, it's confirmed that, okay, it was a weird way to get into the park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and they're back on a real road, and everything's good again. Derek asked Leia, where he should park because they're on this really narrow road, and there didn't seem to be a parking lot. There also didn't seem to be anybody else on this field or on the road. It's this huge, open, beautiful space, but it didn't look well populated or like it was well traveled. But she said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. And so Derek starts driving up this road, and he sees, maybe 300 feet ahead, the dim lights of another car making its way down the road toward him. And now it was dark enough that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. And so he didn't know if it was going to be some big truck or something like that. And so what he did was he just pulled over as far to the side of the road as he could to allow this vehicle to pass. Even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they were passing him, he figured he'd just give them the right of way. And so as they start moving forward, he can see that it's actually this big van and they're moving pretty slowly and he's just kind of waiting for them to pass. And he's not thinking anything of it. He's just assuming this is just another person at the park. And this van, instead of passing him, actually turns at the last second and almost goes bumper to bumper with Derek's car. He doesn't crash into it, but he stops just in front of Derek's car. And so Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop, and he's super aggressive. He really believes in his training. And so as soon as this guy stopped in front of him and blocked the path for him, red flags are going up for Derek. And he knows something's wrong with this van. And instinctively he says, Leah, stay here. He grabs this flashlight that he kept right in the center console. And he jumped out of the car and went right to the driver's side door of this van to confront this guy. And when he got up to the driver's side door, it was this really big dude who looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to him with his flashlight. And Derek's like, what are you doing, man? Why are you blocking me in? And the guy's like, oh, hey, sorry. I'm the caretaker here of this whole property, and we've had an issue with poachers in the area, and I was concerned you guys were poachers. It doesn't look like you're poachers, though. And Derek's like, no, we're not poachers. We're going stargazing. I'm on my first date here. And the caretaker's like, I am so sorry. Please get back in your car. Go and enjoy your night. And at that, he backed up, did a 3-point turn, and drove right back up that road where he came from and disappeared down on the other side of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, making sure this guy was gone. And then he turned around and he got back in the car, and he kind of joked with Leah, and he's like, yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him. And that's why he stopped us. But when he looked over at Leah to see her reaction to his hilarious joke, she wasn't paying attention to him. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, which Derek did think was a little odd. You'd think that she'd be more interested in this strange thing that just happened. Some weirdo just blocked them in, and he's confronting him. You'd think she'd be interested in that on some level. She might want to know what he said to the guy and what the guy said to him. But she didn't seem to care. She was just really invested in whoever she was texting on her phone. And so Derek thinks whatever, and he throws the car back in gear and continues up the trail the way they were going before they were stopped. So Derek continues down the road just a little ways until he sees a little dirt lot that's butted up against this huge field they're going to be hanging out on for the night. And so he pulls into the lot, backs into a space, and he and Leah get out and they put a blanket out right next to the car but on the grass on the hill. And they get their food out and their wine out and they sit down. And pretty quickly they start swapping stories and they're laughing and they're stargazing and they're having some wine and everything's really great. After about an hour, it's totally dark outside and Derek is laying on the hill facing back towards his car and towards the road they were on. And he notices to his left, up at the top of the hill, the same area where the van had come from originally and where it went back to after they spoke that one time. Derek is looking out there and he sees headlights, and it's the van. And now the van is driving down the road, not leisurely like it was before, but they are flying down the hill. And before Derek or Leah have a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it comes flying into the parking lot and practically hits his car and comes to a stop where it's boxed his car in. So, even if he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. And so Derek jumps up, Leah jumps up, and the guy, the caretaker, the nice caretaker he talked to before, he hops out of the driver's seat and he walks around the front of the van. He's got this pipe in his hand, and he looks at Derek and he's like, "Give me your keys and your wallet." And again, Derek is this brand new cop. He's 21 years old. He's not about to let this guy push him around. And so, he doesn't do anything at first. He doesn't know what he's going to do, but he doesn't do anything at first. He just looks at this guy and he shows him that I'm not just going to fall over, because he told me to. But then Derek is given a huge curveball when Leah, his date, stands up and runs over to this guy and stands next to him and turns around and looks at Derek and goes, "Come on, give us your keys and wallet." And Derek's like, "Great. I'm getting set up by my date who I spent the past 2 hours with, who I thought I had a connection with this girl." And so now Derek is just standing there doing nothing, not to be tough, but because he's in shock. He feels so betrayed by Leah. And he just feels like, how could this have happened? And in that moment, Leah walks to the back of the van, and she gets a metal pipe. She comes back around and she goes, "Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you." And this is when Derek looks at them both and he goes, "No." And as soon as he said that, the big guy tackles him. He gets thrown to the ground, but Derek can handle himself. And very quickly, he was able to get up and he drew his concealed carry pistol, and he's aiming it at the big guy, and then back at Leah. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm a cop. Go ahead and put your hands up now." As soon as they saw the gun, they both dropped their pipes and put their hands up. And so, as he's holding them both at gunpoint, he's looking over at Leah like, "Really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now?" As he's doing that, he has to get his cell phone out of his pocket, type in 911, and then call dispatch and had to say who he was, what his badge number was, what happened, and where he is. And where he is was difficult to describe. And so, as he's trying to explain these directions, and he's saying, "Oh, yep. Go left at the light. And then there's a gas station there. You're going to go up this field. You're going to see me. I got these 2 people at gunpoint." As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other and they just turn around and bolt. They figure he's distracted. We can at least get behind the van and run into the forest before he's going to catch us. And so, instinctively, he takes off running after them and he chases them for about 30 seconds into the tree line before he starts hearing gunshots. And they weren't his. Someone's shooting at him. And he sees the muzzle flash out in the middle of the forest and he's like, "Yeah, I'm not doing this." He turns around, runs back to his vehicle. He starts it up and he has to basically smash into the van, back into the fence over and over again like Austin Powers, like a 25-point turn before. He was barely able to grind his way out and peel out of this park. And so Derek pulls into the nearest gas station. He calls up dispatch and he says, "Hey, I just called 911 like 5-10 minutes ago and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody. Here's my name. Here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now?" And they said, "Yep, we'll send some too." And so a police cruiser shows up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him and they got out and he explained again what happened and they kind of gave him a hard time for getting catfished on his very first date. But at the same time, they knew it could have gone really badly. And so they decide they're going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park. And so they get up to the park, and Derek points ahead and he goes, "That's the van. It's still here." And so they drive up and they stop short of the van. And the 2 uniformed officers, they turn to Derek and they're like, "Just stay in here. We're going to go check this van." And so Derek's sitting in the car watching these guys go up to the vehicle, guns drawn. They're looking all around. They're clearing behind the vehicle. They're looking in the wood line. There's nobody there. And at some point, he sees them put their pistols away. and they go in the van. They're shining their flashlights all around. They're looking in the back, looking in the front. And then after a few minutes, they walk back to the cruiser. And as soon as they got in, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him. Now, whatever they had seen in the van was definitely not something they were going to joke about. And they turned to him, and they're like, the back of the van, it was just knives and saws and pistols and rifles and lighter fluid and chains and handcuffs and duct tape. It was just awful. And looks like there might even be blood on the ground. The two officers immediately called in additional backup. And before long, it was a full-fledged circus around this van. A crime scene investigation unit and other police officers, spotlight set up, and they went out looking in the woods for these people, but they never found the guy. They never found the girl. And Derek would tell the other investigators, hey, she works at this hair salon like right down the road. I picked her up there. And so they went over to the hair salon and they wound up talking to the people there, and they said, we've never heard of Leah. And when they showed them a picture of Leah, they were like, we've never seen her before. And so they came back and they told Derek, look, she's a con artist. This whole thing, your whole relationship with her, has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing. That's all it ever was. And so for Derek, that was crushing. And he swore off Tinder immediately. He did not want to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him more than just being taken advantage of is what would have happened if I wasn't concealed carrying. Would I have wound up in the back of that van? Simply put, a goth is someone who finds beauty in things that most other people consider to be pretty dark. But most Americans tend to associate the term goth with the teenagers of the late 90s and early 2000s that wore all black and wore heavy black boots and would hang out in cemeteries. And while that representation of goth culture is, of course, limited, it is a good representation of the two protagonists in today's story, best friends Rachel and Molly. In the 1990s, Rachel and Molly were full-blown goths. They had black hair, black makeup, black clothes. They had the black, heavy combat boots. And at one point, they and their other goth friends started hanging out in a cemetery to be kind of ironic and funny. Like, look at us. We're goth. We hang out in cemeteries. And then they actually enjoyed it and began hanging out in a cemetery like every weekend. One Friday night, Molly calls Rachel to go hang out in the cemetery. And as it happened, Rachel was just sitting at home, and she was bored out of her mind. And so the call came at a perfect time. And so Rachel's like, yeah, I'd love to go. So she flies downstairs, and she sits on her front step, and she's waiting for Molly to show up. And eventually, Molly's car rolls down the street. And Rachel immediately recognizes that Molly is the only one in the car. And Rachel, whenever she would go to the cemetery at night with Molly, they were always there with a group of at least 4 people. Even though they liked hanging out in the cemetery, they did recognize that it was a little bit creepy at night to be out there. And so they liked kind of rolling in a fairly big group. And so Rachel hops in the car, and her first question to Molly is, where is everybody? Are they meeting us there? And Molly said, oh no, everybody else is either working or they're kind of hungover from the party from last night. So it's just us two. I hope that's okay. And at the time, Rachel actually in her head was like, no, I don't really want to do this anymore. But she was like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we'll just go. Just the two of us. It'll be fine. Molly takes off from Rachel's house, and she makes the familiar kind of winding commute to the front gate of this enormous cemetery that sits right in the center of town. They drive underneath this massive wrought iron gate that looks very medieval, very foreboding. It looks like it's out of a cheesy horror movie. This cliché entrance to a cemetery. And so they go through there, and they're on this road that stretches all the way down through the cemetery and basically splits it in two. On the left side as you're driving in was an area closest to town, and also it butted up against a major public university. And then on this side of the cemetery, you had a bunch of residential houses that butted up against the side of the cemetery. And where Molly and Rachel and their crew liked to go was on the right side all the way back in the corner, because there was a section that was kind of situated between these two hills where not only were they obscured from the cemetery road and the main road once they were down in this little depression, there was also no houses that happened to look over that spot. So it was kind of like the hidden section of the cemetery. And there was also this big boulder that people sat on, and a big tree you could lean up against. So that was their spot. So Molly drives in the gates. She heads down that road, and she turns right onto a dead-end road. She takes that down about a couple 100 meters till it dead ends, and they park. And then the girls get out of the car. They light up cigarettes, and they walk down this hill that's just beyond where this dead end comes to an end. And so they walk down this hill, and it brings them to this clearing where this big rock and tree is. Rachel hops up on the rock, and she turns around. So, she's facing back up the hill. They just walk down, and Molly is right next to her on her right, leaning up against the tree. And for the next hour or so, they just crushed cigarettes and talked about their various boyfriend drama and life drama and whatever else they wanted to talk about. After a while, the girls started to smell a bonfire. And from where they were sitting, they could see a hill in front of them. And there was actually another hill over here. And so, their view is pretty obscured out of this little valley they're in. So, they can't see any fires anywhere. And so they assumed that what they're smelling was a fire coming from the other side of the cemetery, because there's that huge university over there. And they knew sometimes the college kids would come onto the cemetery, and they would light fires over there. And inevitably the police would get called, and they would break up the fire because you're not allowed to have a fire on the cemetery. And whenever they did that, the police would actually make rounds around the entire cemetery. And historically, basically, if you were there hanging out, they would tell you to leave. And so they think, okay, this is probably a good time to leave because probably in the next 30 minutes to an hour, the police are going to be here. They're going to come over here, see our car, and they're going to ask us what we're doing, and we're going to have to leave. So, let's just leave now. So Rachel hops off the rock, and the two of them begin meandering their way back up the hill towards the car. When they get about halfway up the hill, they notice to their right something bright. Now, because they were higher up, they could actually see over the hill to their right. And what they were seeing was the top of a bonfire. So, the girls take a couple more steps up the hill to gain some elevation to hopefully be able to see better down into where this fire is. But even when they're up almost at the top of the hill, that fire is too far down on the other side of that hill that they can't see any people, and they can't really tell how big the fire is. They're just basically seeing the top flickers of it. Even though they don't know anything about the people over there at this fire, what they do know is when they showed up, there was no fire over there. They would have recognized it. So, whoever's over there had to have shown up and built this fire while Rachel and Molly were down at the rock and tree, which means there's a pretty good chance they didn't see Rachel and Molly. This is a pretty private area. Their car was parked a little bit off to the side of the trail. And so Molly picks up on this and she says to Rachel, "Hey, let's sneak back down and walk up their hill and look down and see who's here. I bet it's a bunch of college kids. It'll be funny to see what they're doing." But Rachel had a weird feeling about it. She's thinking to herself, if this is college kids, why would they have their bonfire this far away from campus? I mean, this is literally the farthest point away from the side of the cemetery that's close to their campus. If they're having a party over here, there's a good chance that anybody going to it is going to need to drive. And that just doesn't make sense if you can just walk to the other side of the campus and have a bonfire over there. And so Rachel is logically deducing that this is probably not college kids. But who else is having a bonfire in the secret section of the cemetery in the middle of the night? And Rachel's thinking that now if the police come here, they're definitely going to see us because we're so close to this bonfire. And so it's probably not a good idea to stick around much longer. But despite Rachel's hesitations, she is intrigued, and she just wants to see what's going on over there. So, the two girls walk down the hill. They make it down to the rock and the tree. Then, they turn left, and they begin walking up this other hill, the hill that's going to bring them up to this fire. And so, they only get a few steps up this hill when they're suddenly hit with this disgusting, putrid smell that just encompasses them, and it makes them gag, and they're covering their mouth and their nose. And Rachel exclaims, "Oh my God, what is that?" And then as soon as she says it, she realizes she was really loud. And she's like, and Molly's like, and they both freeze, wondering if the people on the other side of the hill have heard them. And after a little bit of silence, Molly's like, "You want to keep going?" And Rachel's like, "No, we got to go." Between the horrible smell that's obviously coming from this weird fire and the fact that Rachel basically just gave them away. And so for all they know, These people on the other side of this hill have heard us, and now they're waiting for us to come over the edge, and it would be incredibly awkward if we were to suddenly stumble upon their bonfire. Rachel was already considering these implications, and she urged, "Let's go. We need to leave now." Molly, while a bit let down, understood the situation. The two girls turned and started walking back the way they came. They passed the tree and the rock on their left, then turned right, about to head up the hill that led to their car. Just then, Rachel glanced back at the hill towards the fire, the direction they'd initially been headed. Standing at the crest of that hill was a man just looking down at them. The fire behind him cast him in a dramatic light, and they could clearly see that it was a man just standing there, watching them. Immediately, both girls felt a wave of discomfort wash over them. It was as if they had been caught in the act of spying. Even though they hadn't actually been caught doing anything wrong, that was their intention. They felt like they'd almost been caught red-handed. Molly and Rachel quickly turned and started walking up the hill, heads down, feeling self-conscious. They took a few more steps up the incline. Rachel looked again to where the man had been standing, but he was gone. Rachel felt a brief sense of relief, but then she realized he wasn't gone. He was moving, practically power walking down the hill directly toward them. Rachel gasped, grabbed Molly, and shoved her forward, exclaiming, "Go, go, go, go." They started running up the hill as fast as they could. Rachel glanced back and saw the man was now running after them. He was now down by the rock and the tree, and he was gaining ground. They sprinted over the top of the hill and ran toward Molly's car. Molly fumbled with her keys, trying to unlock the car, while Rachel yelled, "Hurry up, hurry up, hurry up." Finally, she managed to get the door open, and they both jumped inside. Rachel locked the doors as Molly turned the key in the ignition. Rachel was looking out the back window, waiting to see the man. Sure enough, as they started to pull away, she saw his head appear over the ridge, just enough so he could clearly see them leaving. Then he ducked back down and disappeared from view. The two of them sped down the road, made a left turn onto the main drive, and raced out of the cemetery. For the first few minutes of the drive, neither of them said a word. The experience had been genuinely traumatic. It was also incredibly confusing, as they had initially intended to spy on college kids having a bonfire. They were then assaulted by that awful smell, and now this man, who definitely didn't look like a college kid and seemed to be in his 40s, was chasing them. When they finally started talking about it, they couldn't reach a rational conclusion about what had just happened. They were both very shaken, and they decided to just go home and discuss it the next day. Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, and then Molly went home. Both girls went straight to bed. The next morning, Rachel woke up and went down to the kitchen, where her mom was already having her morning coffee. Rachel sat down, but she's not usually a big talker. She wasn't about to start with, "Hey, guess what happened to me last night at the cemetery?" Instead, she just sat there quietly. For a while, her mom casually talked about work and her plans for the day. Then suddenly, it was like her mom had an epiphany. She exclaimed, "Rachel, Rachel, did you hear what happened last night?" Rachel replied, "No way." Her mom said, "Someone I work with, I don't know her personally, but she works in the same building as me. She got kidnapped from the parking garage where I park my car. I've seen her park there. She got kidnapped." Rachel responded, "Oh my God, really? What happened to her? Did they find her?" Her mom replied, "Yeah, but it was too late. The person who kidnapped her had killed her and then tried to dispose of her body at the cemetery by burning her in a bonfire." Rachel suddenly felt sick because now she understood what had been happening the night before, and she knew what that smell was. Rachel immediately told her mom everything that had happened the night before. Her mom was horrified, especially by the fact that they had clearly been there when the killer arrived, set up shop, and started burning the body. They had been just 50 meters away the whole time. Her mom insisted, "You and Molly have to go to the police station and make a statement. They haven't caught this person yet. You saw this person. You have to tell them." Rachel called Molly and broke the news about what had actually been happening the night before, who had actually been chasing them to their car, and said, "We have to go to the police station." They agreed and went down to the police station to tell them what happened. However, they hadn't gotten a very good look at him. They could only say that he was maybe in his 40s and of average height. The police wrote it all down, but basically said, "Look, if you can think of any more details, we'd love to hear them, because this isn't really enough to go on." The girls went back home and started thinking, did he see us? Does he know that we saw him? Do you think he knows that we know he's a killer now? They were freaking out. Fortunately, within 48 hours, the police actually caught the guy because he was driving around in the murder victim's car and someone spotted him. They pulled him over, and he confessed. He went to jail. Needless to say, Rachel and Molly were incredibly thankful that when they started walking up that hill and smelled that awful odor, Rachel had said, "Let's not go any further. Let's just leave." If they had continued and gone to the other side, they could have ended up in the bonfire too. Music. The following stories all take place in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. On New Year's Eve in 1980, 20-year-old Karen Potak was out at a bar with her friends, celebrating. At some point during the night, she slipped out because she didn't want to stay any longer and started walking home. She wasn't wearing a jacket, and it was very cold outside. She was stumbling through the streets when a man saw her, pulled over, and offered her a ride home. She was somewhat intoxicated, so she agreed to get into his car, and they drove off. A couple of hours later, around 3 a.m., the police received a phone call. "Please, this is an emergency. Police, send a squad to Pierce Butler Road. Menberg Manufacturing Company machine shop, please. And an ambulance, too. There's a girl there. Can you tell me what happened to her? Just hurry. She's lying on the ground in the back, by the railroad tracks by the air. What's the address?" The caller replied, "I don't know. Who are you?" Using the information from the caller, the police arrived in the back of that building and found Karen Potak. She had been repeatedly bludgeoned over the head with a tire iron and then left for dead. Miraculously, she survived, but due to her head injury, she forgot almost everything about that night, including a description of the man who picked her up, who probably attacked her, and who probably was the one who called the police. The police tried to interview people in the area around where she was found, but it was a deserted location, no one knew anything, and there was no physical evidence at the scene. So the case went cold. Then, 5 months later, the police received another phone call. "Will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody else." At this point, the police hadn't connected this call with the one that immediately preceded finding Karen Potak. They didn't think it was the same person. Since there were no instructions in this call on where to find the caller, they didn't have anything to go on. They took note of it but ultimately disregarded it. Just a few hours later, a group of teenagers walking through the forest found a dead body. The body was of 18-year-old Kimberly Compton, who had just moved to Minnesota. She had graduated high school and decided she wanted a fresh start. She took a bus to Minnesota, got off, and went into the first restaurant she saw, a diner. She sat down alone and was eating when a man approached her and asked, "Hey, can I sit down with you?" She let him sit down and he asked, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" She said, "Oh, I just moved here." The man offered to drive her around town and show her the sights, and she thought it was a great idea. 15 minutes later, he killed her with an ice pick. At this point, the police began to suspect that the person who kept calling them immediately before women were found attacked might be the same person. 2 days after Compton was killed, they received another call that confirmed their suspicions. "Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry about what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had this happen. I am so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every day, and I can't believe it. Feels like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else." From this point forward, they referred to this caller as the Weepy-Voiced Killer. Even though they had his voice recorded, they didn't have any physical evidence because he hadn't left any at the scene with Compton either. They didn't have much to go on. The police went to the diner, talked to the staff, and gave a general description of the Weepy-Voiced Killer, but it wasn't enough to pinpoint a suspect. Once again, this case went cold. 6 months later, the police received yet another call. Police emergency, please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one over. I don't know what's doing this to me. I'm sick. I'm going to kill myself. I'm just going to die with me. I killed both. A day later, they found the body of 40-year-old Barbara Simons floating in the Mississippi River, lodged against some brush. The night before, Barbara had been out at a bar and offered a cigarette to a man she hadn't met before. They started flirting and seemed to hit it off. At one point, they decided to leave together. Before they left, Barbara turned to one of the waitresses and jokingly said, "Boy, I hope he's nice, because I'm leaving with him." For whatever reason, the waitress had a really bad feeling about it and made a point of getting a good look at the man Barbara was leaving with. That man, of course, would turn out to be the Weepy-Voiced Killer. As soon as he and Barbara left the bar, he stabbed her to death and threw her in the Mississippi River. After the police began investigating, they went to the bar and interviewed the waitress. She said, "I got a really good look at this guy." The police showed her hundreds of mugshots of previously convicted felons in the area. She immediately identified 38-year-old Paul Stefani and said, "That's the guy." Paul had been convicted of aggravated assault and had a history of mental illness. Paul was immediately put under surveillance, but within 24 hours, he managed to lose his tail and went straight into downtown Minneapolis, where he picked up 19-year-old street worker Denise Williams. Paul took her down a dark alleyway, and she sensed that something was wrong. She grabbed a glass bottle from the floor of the car. When he went to attack her, she managed to hit him in the head, cutting his face badly. She defended herself enough to get out of the car, run away, and save her life. A neighbor saw her running from the car and witnessed the exchange. Uncomfortable with what he saw, he called 911. By the time the police arrived, Paul was long gone. That same night, the police received another call from the Weepy-Voiced Killer. This one was a little different. He was actually asking for help. "I need an ambulance." "Where?" 1505 Westminster. 1505 Westminster. "What's the problem?" "I'm all cut up. I got beat up." "What's your apartment number?" "I'm bleeding." "Where are you bleeding from?" "On my arm, my face, my head." By the time this call was made, audio recordings of his previous phone calls had been made public. They were aired on radio shows and on TV. People had heard his voice, and it was fairly distinctive. The dispatcher recognized his voice and told the police, "There's a chance the Weepy-Voiced Killer just called us." An ambulance picked up Paul Stefani and took him to the hospital. While he was sitting in his hospital bed, the police walked in and apprehended him. He pled not guilty, and the prosecutors didn't have much evidence connecting him to each of the attacks. They had the audio recordings, but that was about it. He received 58 years in prison, not a life sentence. Considering his age, it effectively became a life sentence. 12 years into that sentence, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and told he had only a year to live. At that point, he confessed to all of the attacks, including one they didn't know about. He murdered 33-year-old Kathleen Greening in her own home, but he hadn't called the police afterward. Paul died shortly after his confessions. Music. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. If you're looking for a recommendation from me, I suggest this video right here. So, give it a watch. Alright, until next time, see you.